So as Carolyn said, my name is Jack Swab. I am a grad student at the University of Kentucky. And today I'd like to talk about sustainability in the context of digital cartography and in the context of the practice of cartography. So digital cartography has long been driven by sustainability, environmentalism, the idea that as cartographers we have and can show unique insights onto the natural world and how it operates. If we look and take a historical approach to the way in which GIS formulated, Roger Tomlinson, that is the guy behind the concept of GIS, his work that kind of developed GIS came out of government work that he was doing in Canada for natural resources. If we look at the first kind of computer software that could be called GIS at the Harvard Lab for computer graphics, much of that money that was spent to develop early GIS software came out of mapping pollution, mapping other forms of environmental problems for the federal government. And in fact, if we think of the name ESRI, which stands for Environmental Science Research Institute, it's right there in the name. So much of our discipline and what we've been doing is, or at least within the past 25 years, has been focused on or came out of various environmental efforts. And so I want to look at sustainability in cartography in terms of the practice and what it means to actually practice a sustainable digital cartography. And so for cartographic sustainability, I argue that there are three basic pillars of this: the social, the economic, and the environmental. And so if any of you are familiar with corporate sustainability at all, these are the same three types of pillars. Problematic in some ways, but I think for the purposes of this presentation actually works quite well. And so I think cartographers have been doing a really good job of trying to look at social sustainability as we work to diversify who defines themselves as a cartographer, who comes to NACIS conferences and things like that. That is part of social sustainability. Looking at public participatory mapping, understanding the power of maps, all allows us to understand the ways in which our craft and the people who make maps have an impact on the world. But these two other factors, the economic and the environmental, are a little bit harder to define and a little bit more difficult to understand. And so I try to tease that out. I don't think quite fully, but I try to tease that out in this presentation. And so we've already seen this book come up once before, but Matthew Edney's most recent book that came out earlier this year, Cartography, the Ideal and Its History, in that Edney talks about mapping as a process. In other words, that as cartographers, we should not just study the final map that is created, but rather the entire process that goes into making that data, or to making that map, to collecting that data, circulating it, and whatnot. And so I think that looking at sustainability in cartography fits very well within this idea of mapping as a process. And so to get back to the idea of the history of cartography, which is where I find many of my interests, I think it would be interesting to kind of compare the processes of making a map, making a print map versus making a digital map, and I guess what we could call the carbon output of it, roughly. So when we think about making print cartography, there's data collection. So you go out, you collect the data, you wrangle it, you visualize it, you end up creating a map, you print that map up, it gets circulated out, people buy it, and then I call it archiving, which is not the traditional sense of putting it into a library, but a roadmap goes in a glove compartment box. Some of them end up in map libraries, others get thrown out. They have uses. But when we think, and so here in this process, the carbon intensive processes come actually from the data collection and the production of the map itself. So the amount of effort it takes to go out and not only find the data, but then actually to make maps that then everybody gets. So all the heavy metals involved in creating the ink for the maps, all the trees cut down to actually create the paper, whatnot. Those are all carbon intensive. And when we think about digital cartography, we have essentially the same sort of process, but I argue that actually while we think that the environmental impacts actually may have receded, actually we've really just shifted where the environmental impacts are. So instead of data collection and production, I argue that there's a tremendous environmental impact to the way in which we now circulate maps and the way in which we archive maps. And this comes out of the fact that, well, it's digital and they are now ubiquitous. And so this number, which I am not going to read out to you, I think it's 2.5 quintillion gigabytes of data, or 2.5 exabytes of data, is the amount of data that is produced every year, or I'm sorry, not every year, every day from the internet. Just random things, emails being sent back and forth and whatnot. And of course, this data is a little bit old. It's from 2014. But it really shows how much data is being produced and how much of that data, while I don't know exactly how much of that data is necessarily geospatial, when we know that so much, especially so much of that data, so much data now has a spatial component to it. This is a big amount of data that is being produced. Now, obviously, not all of it stays on servers. Not all of it is constantly there, but we are constantly churning and creating data all the time. And so this naturally leads us into some of the ways in which having this much data being created and having to manage this much data we have to deal with. The largest is e-waste, which if I was giving this presentation 25 years ago, would be a very, very hot topic. But over the past couple of decades, as electronics recycling has gotten better, and as computers have longer lifespans, has declined a little bit. But I argue that e-waste, especially in the context of cartography, is not just our old computers that we don't necessarily use anymore, but it's all the equipment that goes around it as well. So how many of us have 15, 25 USBs scattered around our houses, our apartments, our offices, everywhere? Who knows what the hell's on them? Who knows the last time you used it? That is an example of e-waste where functionally, yes, that USB still works, but there's all sorts of data on it that you don't know what it is. If it was destroyed tomorrow, you probably wouldn't even notice it. And so the other side of this from e-waste is the energy usage. And so this is really kind of what has been taking off over the past couple years, and looking at the ways in which the increasing number of data centers, the increase in the number of cloud computing and cloud storage is essentially moving a lot of the processes that we used to have to do in-house, sometimes literally in our own homes, but also in our offices, to some remote place. And so what that means is that, sure, now not only are we having to spend all sorts of money to build all of these new servers and whatnot, we are also having all sorts of energy usage to keep these servers up and running and to allow us to have access to our data 24/7. And so this is obviously not just in terms of cartography. Netflix, anything that is cloud-based is kind of falls underneath this. Also, a shout out to Nick Lawley, who had a nice article about Bitcoin mining, which is where a lot of this attention has been driven. The idea that Bitcoin, kind of similarly, in a similar vein, is very computationally driven, but it is creating a value that we don't really quite understand what you're going to be able to do with it yet. While obviously cartography is different, that it's kind of the same sort of underlying principles, just a different product. So when we think about circulating digital cartography, I want to use an example that's not necessarily map-driven, but that looks at the carbon output of tweets. So in the cartography community, as I'm sure we are all quite well aware, Twitter is our favorite mode to communicate. And so if we take basically, I just did a quick search on this, that there have been over 500 tweets with the hashtag NACIS 2019 over the past couple weeks. And there was a 2010 estimate that estimated that every tweet, every like of a tweet, every retweet of a tweet put out 0.02 grams of CO2 into the atmosphere. So that would mean that these 500 plus tweets that have been put out, circulated 10 grams of CO2 over the past while. Now, 10 grams of CO2 is really, really, really low. The average human puts out about 2.5 pounds of CO2 just breathing. So this is not a significant number. But when we think about the fact that this is only taking into account textual data, not maps, not any sort of raster image that is harder to process, that it is not accounting for viral maps, all sorts of different things, the actual environmental impact of circulating digital cartography is quite large. But what I really think is actually more damaging is the idea of archiving modern cartography. And again, when I say archiving, I don't mean in the traditional sense of a special collections or an actual archive. But the fact that in 2019, we download our data from the cloud because we don't trust the cloud with it anymore. And so now we have 2 copies of the same exact data residing on 2 different machines. And how, this is just a basic part of cartographic practice and a basic part of data science, of having multiple copies of data all over the place. There's a similar, before I get to that, also, I think it's also important to talk about here the ways in which, as cartographers, we go through multiple iterations of maps. If you save all the drafts, all those drafts have to go somewhere. They have to be saved. Or they don't necessarily have to be saved, but when you are saving them, they are taking up space on the cloud, and thus there's energy being used to maintain them when we really don't have no use for them. Similarly, we can look at the idea of freemium services, so this tweet about Google Fusion tables, but looking at the ways in which, as these services break down, this data just is still sitting on corporate servers, running, not working, just sitting there. And so there has been some pushback about whether cloud computing is actually more environmentally beneficial or not. Basically, there are some people saying that these sorts of environmental costs are really not what they're cracked up to be, and that frankly, there's a lot of environmental benefits to using them, in addition to financial benefits for companies essentially to outsource their cloud storage and all other sorts of data needs to large tech firms. But if you've been paying attention to the news over the past couple of weeks, we know that these large tech companies are in this game to make money, and that these large tech companies are doing things that are not necessarily what we want them, or what we would think that they would be doing. And so I don't quite necessarily believe that cloud computing is as environmentally friendly as they say it is. And so trying to contextualize this, it's important to think about the ways in which, obviously, the narratives that we're being told, while they can be a little bit muddy, there are actual environmental impacts to what we're doing. So that kind of leads us to the next question. What can we do? As cartographers, what is kind of the best mode of action for us going forward? And I think the best way to think about this is Marie Kondo. And so to ask yourself if your shapefile brings you joy or not. But in a real sense of thinking about all the different types of data that we have saved, all the sorts of projects that we did 2-3 years ago. Do you really need that layer? Do you really need to know where the boundaries of the city of Tacoma are when you can just go and re-download it if you need to? Which also does have its own environmental impact, but one that's different. So I argue that we should be incorporating data cleanups into part of our regular workflow, not just because it's good to make sure that you're not using bad data, but just because, do you really need to keep all this stuff? As someone who is interested in the history of cartography, please don't get rid of everything. We would like to know a little bit of something for the future. But when we think about the process from print cartography to digital, so much of printed material was disposed of, and it was easier to sort through as opposed to today digitally, where it's much easier just to kind of let things be because it's out of sight and out of mind. So asking ourselves, I think the final question, what do we find important about our practice as cartographers, is really important. And if we see ourselves as a discipline as trying to convince people in terms of through our products, by giving people a narrative about the environment and about its importance to protect the environment, we should also be thinking about the ways in which our own craft has and will continue to have impacts on the environment. So thank you very much.